Hello everybody and welcome to the Garage Clinic. My name is Rusty. This video series and the associated Facebook page are dedicated to this 1980 Trans Am and me getting it exactly like I want it. Today we're going to talk about the rear end. In the mid 60s, General Motors developed a new family of rear ends that ended up becoming the 10 bolt and the 12 bolt. The 10 bolt ended up becoming the rear end that was used in just absolutely millions of vehicles, whether it's pickup trucks or performance cars or sedans. There's just tons of them out there. The 8.5 inch, which is in the back of the Trans Am, worked beautifully for a very, very long time. But as we get into the modern powertrains or even the modern cylinder heads that we can add to these older large cubic inch engines, we can get an awful lot of power. The 10 bolt was put into the Grand National, which is one of the examples that a lot of folks like to hold as an example of the success of the 10 bolt. It's a very, very good rear end and it can be made to be very stout, but we need to look at efficiencies. Does it make sense to build a 10 bolt to be strong, or are there other options? What I began to look at was adding or changing the differential to a true track. Beefier axles, more splines on the axles, C-clip eliminators, welding the axle tubes, all the things to build a 10 bolt to hold torque and horsepower. In the older days, the options would have been to switch to a 12 bolt, or if you had the skills and the tools and the knowledge to modify a Ford 9-inch to fit your car. But for someone like me, a weekend warrior, I'm tinkering on my own car. You know, I don't have those kind of tools, I don't have that kind of knowledge, I don't have that kind of skill set. So the Ford 9-inch was out of the question for me. But nowadays there's a bunch of companies building them. You can go full race, you can go very, very high dollar. That's not in the budget for me in this car. There are companies like Moser, Curry, Strange, Quick Performance. And I found that Pro Touring FBody, I didn't even know they built rear ends until I kind of happened to stumble on it. So I had been looking at one of their competitors that was in the lower price range and had decided to use that when I found out that Dave made these. What I found is that the Ford 9-inch for the Pro Touring FBody was made in the same shop as the housings for some of the other major brands that you would certainly recognize. And when you compare the options to the cheaper rear ends to what comes fairly standard on this one, you're actually saving money in the long run. They got the thicker walls, they got the double welded gussets into where the axle tubes go into the differential. It's beautiful welding. We got powder coated this one. It's got the jack plate at the bottom of the rear end so we don't damage anything. The best part about this is they make it to fit this car. It already came with a 4-degree cant for the pinion angle. It came with the pads to fit the leaf springs for the second generation F-body. One of the things that I asked for to be changed was the housing end. We still get the advantage of the large Ford axle bearing. However, the bolt pattern on the end of my axles, I had them match the bolt pattern at the end of the 10 bolt or the 12 bolt, so you can use the General Motors rear brakes. This way, my car came with the rear discs anyway. Yeah, I know they're not the greatest as far as racing is concerned, but at this point I don't have to buy rear brakes, and there are tons of options for that rear end, so now those will fit this one. In essence, what I've got is a Ford 9-inch rear end that I had to do no cutting, no welding, no modification to, and it was a bolt-in unit for the 1980 Trans Am. So clearly this will fit anything from a 70.5 to an 81. I'm sure they make them for other options as well, but for the Firebird Camaro, if you want a Ford 9-inch rear end, this thing is fantastic and it's easy to install. I did it by myself and I've never done this before. Leverage is your friend when you're doing it by yourself. Anyway, I wanted to show you a few things about how we went about doing that. So here are just a couple of shots of what we had to do to get the rear end out of the car. It's fairly simple, just front and rear bolts on the leaf springs, taking the shocks apart, removing the brakes and the brake lines. And earlier when I said leverage is your friend, this is what I was talking about if you're doing it by yourself. Since I'm going to be reusing the rear brakes from the 10 bolt, there are two pieces of this entire rear end that I need. And that's the caliper brackets from each side. To remove those, I've got to begin with removing the rear differential cover. Now we have to remove the small bolt that holds the differential locking pin in its position. Once the bolt is out, the pin will slide out easily. So with a steel hammer, I hit the end of the axle and knocked it inward to release the tension on the C-clip. Knocked the C-clip loose and picked it up with a magnet at the bottom of the housing. Then a small pry bar from the center diff pushed out on the axle a bit and was able to pull it out the rest of the way with my hand. All this disassembly just to get the caliper brackets that I need to reuse. Now the fun stuff. You got the strange axles and that brand new housing. The welds on these gussets give you a good idea of what kind of quality has gone into this thing. This is not a repurposed original rear end, this is all brand new stuff. The flanges are nice and flat. The welding is just magnificent. The powder coating looks beautiful. Here are the perches that are set up to be specific to the FBody. And here's the real trick, is that the end of the housing perfectly matches the bolt pattern for the 12 bolt or the 10 bolt. However, it houses the large forward axle bearing. Here's a good look at the interior of the housing. You can see how the axle tubes are all welded in. The fold-over tabs and the perch for the brake valve are in the same spots as the 10 bolt, so even the brake lines bolt right on without having to be modified. It's time to put a medium bead of RTV sealant around the flange so that we can seal the third member in it. I can't tell you how happy I was to be able to drop this thing straight down rather than laying on my back trying to bench press it. As you've seen in the pictures, I've got the rear end housing sitting on top of two furniture dollies. I would have had a video of it, but I hit the wrong button on the camera. Another good example of it being a bolt-in replacement is being able to reuse the factory brake lines. Very, very minor adjustments had to be made to make it fit this housing. Now it's time to install the new stuff, and I'm going to put a light coating of grease onto the where the bearing touches the housing, make it a little easier to slide that in. And with the T-bolts in place, we're able to install the brake caliper brackets. And since we're no longer relying on the C-clips to hold the axles in, we get to put the axle retaining bracket in. And from here on in, you're just reinstalling the factory rear disc brakes, calipers, hooking the lines up, bleeding the brakes out. It's very, very simple. It was specifically recommended to me that I use the Lucas high-performance gear oil that is non-synthetic. Now it's time to install the longer drive shaft and start this thing up and run it through all the gears. I hope you found some of this informative, and whether you did or did not, leave me a comment below. I'd appreciate it if you would like, subscribe to the page, and then go look us up on the Facebook page at The Garage Clinic.